For nearly a century, the US dollar has been more than a currency. It has been a weapon, a shield, and a crown all in one. Nations across the globe have treated it as the ultimate anchor for trade, investment, and savings. It wasn't simply about trust in green paper. It was about trust in the American system, its political stability, its military dominance, and its vast economy that dwarfed all competitors. If you wanted to buy oil, you needed dollars. If you wanted to hold your reserves safe from the storms of global markets, you bought US Treasury bonds. If you wanted to measure your wealth, you did it in dollars. The dollar was the bloodstream of global finance, and every other nation, willingly or unwillingly, was plugged into its circulation. But this grip, though it still feels ironclad, has started to show cracks. Those cracks are not always obvious in daily life. The supermarket shelves are still full. The trading floors still hum. And the financial news still treats the dollar as untouchable. Yet beneath the calm surface, pressure has been building. Countries that once bowed to the dollar's supremacy are beginning to question the price of their obedience. Inflation has weakened the dollar's aura of invincibility, reminding the world that America's fiscal choices echo far beyond its borders. Nations holding trillions in reserves suddenly find their savings eroded, not by their own mistakes, but by Washington's inability or unwillingness to control its own financial machine. Sanctions, too, have weaponized the dollar. When the United States decides to punish a nation, it doesn't always reach for soldiers or missiles, it reaches for its currency. By cutting off countries from the dollar-based financial system, America has shown that it can starve economies without firing a shot. Iran knows this. Russia knows this. Venezuela knows this. Even allies who watch from the sidelines see the message clearly. The dollar is not just a neutral tool of trade. It is a lever of control pulled by Washington at will. And that makes every nation vulnerable. The trust that once made the dollar irresistible is now a double-edged sword. Yes, it is still the deepest and most liquid market. Yes, it still offers safety in times of chaos. But nations are asking, is safety really safety? If it can be taken away overnight, is liquidity truly neutral if it comes with conditions, with oversight, with the risk that tomorrow's political winds might freeze your assets or cripple your trade? The cracks are widening because nations want sovereignty in their financial lives. And sovereignty cannot exist when one country holds the master key. This shift is not driven by sudden rebellion, but by years of accumulated frustration. Consider the endless cycles of US debt ceilings, government shutdowns, and political gridlock. To the world's bankers, central banks, and ministries of finance, these spectacles no longer look like temporary dramas. They look like signs of deeper weakness. They see a superpower unable to govern itself cleanly, unable to control its appetite for borrowing, and unable to guarantee that the safe asset they hold will remain untouched by political chaos. If the dollar is built on trust, then every chaotic headline from Washington chips away at that foundation. Inflation after the pandemic accelerated this erosion. The United States printed unprecedented sums of money to keep its economy alive, and while it kept Wall Street afloat, it exported inflation to the rest of the world. Nations that had saved in dollars suddenly saw their reserves buying less. Emerging economies watched their currencies crumble as the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, pulling capital back into the United States and leaving weaker nations gasping for air. What kind of global currency strangles the very economies it is supposed to serve? That is the question being whispered in ministries from South America to Southeast Asia. Yet, the cracks are not only about economics, they are about psychology. The dollar is powerful. Because people believe it is powerful, but belief is fragile. Once doubt creeps in, once alternatives become visible, the mythology can unravel faster than anyone predicts. We saw a glimpse of this during the global financial crisis of 2008. The very institutions that symbolized American financial might collapsed under their own recklessness. And though the dollar survived, the world learned an unforgettable lesson. Even the titan can stumble. And when the titan stumbles, it shakes the earth beneath everyone's feet. China has been watching this carefully. Every crack in the dollar is a signal. Every sanction, a warning. Every inflationary surge, an opportunity. For Beijing, this is not simply about economics. It is about power. The dollar is the backbone of American influence, the reason Washington can project control across oceans without firing a bullet. Break that backbone, and America's grip on global affairs loosens. This is why the cracks in the dollar's supremacy matter. They are not random flaws, but entry points for rivals who want to rewrite the rules. Consider how the rest of the world perceives dollar dominance today. To some, it is a lifeline, a necessity they cannot imagine living without. But to others, it is a shackle, binding them to a system that does not reflect their interests. If oil producers in the Middle East can sell their product in yuan instead of dollars, why should they continue to accept Washington's terms? If African nations borrowing from China are offered loans and trade settlements in their own currencies, why should they remain chained to a dollar system that has never served them faithfully? The cracks are not only visible, they are widening into paths that lead directly toward alternatives. This is why the dollar's global grip feels less like eternal dominance and more like a fading empire. Empires rarely collapse in a single day. They fray at the edges. They corrode from within. They lose loyalty not because of one event, but because of 1,000 cuts. The dollar is experiencing those cuts now, small, scattered, but relentless. And when you put them together, they form a picture, a world that no longer bows automatically to the green paper with Washington's seal. A world that is ready slowly but surely to imagine life beyond the dollar. When people think of power shifts, they often imagine sudden shocks, wars, coups, collapses that happen overnight and rewrite history in bold strokes. But China does not play that game. It does not announce its intentions with fanfare or noise. Its moves are quiet, calculated, and slow, like a grandmaster studying a chessboard, positioning pieces years in advance. That is why the story of Beijing's financial rise cannot be understood through headlines alone. It must be traced through the invisible scaffolding that has been built brick by brick, far away from the spotlight, forming an infrastructure designed not just for trade, but for control. The Belt and Road Initiative is often spoken of as a development project, a grand network of ports, railways, and roads stretching from Asia into Africa and Europe. But underneath the glossy brochures and ribbon-cutting ceremonies lies something far more potent, the creation of a parallel economic order. When a port in Sri Lanka or a railway in Kenya is funded with Chinese money, built by Chinese firms, and tied to Chinese repayment schedules, it is not just infrastructure. It is influence. Each deal creates dependencies, binding nations not only to Chinese goods and technology, but also to its financial system. Over time, these connections are like threads in a web, delicate when viewed alone, but nearly unbreakable when woven together. At the center of this web is the yuan. Beijing has long understood that to challenge the dollar, it must first make its currency usable beyond its borders. That is why trade deals are increasingly denominated in yuan. Oil contracts signed with Russia, energy imports from the Middle East, and raw materials flowing in from Africa are quietly shifting into China's currency. Every transaction that does not use the dollar weakens Washington's invisible hand and strengthens Beijing's position. Nations accustomed to thinking of the dollar as inevitable are beginning to realize that another path is available, one paved with yuan and backed by promises of investment and political support. But Beijing has not stopped at trade. It has built alternative systems to bypass the dollar-dominated financial networks. The SWIFT system, which underpins global money transfers, has long been one of Washington's most powerful tools of control. If a country is cut off from SWIFT, its economy suffocates. China saw this vulnerability and responded with CIPS, the cross-border interbank payment system, designed to facilitate transactions directly in yuan. While still smaller than SWIFT, CIPS is growing. And more importantly, it represents a choice. Countries fearful of sanctions or tired of dependence can look to CIPS as a way out. Beijing is offering not just an alternative network, but an escape hatch from Washington's grip. Consider also how Beijing ties its financial ambitions to resources. It does not simply buy oil, gas, or minerals. It secures them with long-term contracts, often settled outside the dollar system. A copper mine in Africa, a natural gas field in Central Asia, a port in the Indian Ocean, each of these becomes a node in a larger strategy. Resources are not just bought, they are bound to China's orbit, and the repayment terms are often structured to favor settlements in yuan or through Chinese institutions, further reinforcing dependence. It is not conquest with armies. It is conquest with contract. China also recognizes the psychological dimension of finance. The dollar is not dominant merely because of its practical advantages. It is dominant because people believe in its inevitability. To counter this, Beijing has been working to shift narratives. State media outlets, think tanks, and international conferences repeatedly frame the yuan as the currency of the future, emphasizing stability, sovereignty, and fairness, in contrast to the politicized nature of the dollar. This constant messaging is designed to chip away at the aura of inevitability surrounding the dollar, planting seeds of doubt that grow stronger with every crisis in Washington. Technology, too, plays a crucial role in Beijing's silent construction. Digital payment platforms like Alipay and WeChat Pay have reshaped how hundreds of millions of people handle money within China, but their reach is expanding abroad. By integrating these systems into cross-border trade and tourism, Beijing extends its digital financial ecosystem beyond its own borders. Add to this the Digital Yuan project, and suddenly the infrastructure is no longer just physical. It is virtual, embedded in apps, codes, and payment rails that can operate independently of Western systems. This digital push is not about catching up. It is about leaping ahead, ensuring that when the world looks for faster, more efficient ways to settle transactions, it finds them in Chinese systems. Another overlooked layer of control lies in the lending policies of Chinese banks. Unlike the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, which often tie loans to Western-style reforms and conditions, Chinese lending operates differently. It offers funds with fewer public demands, but with clauses that lock in long-term obligations. A country in debt to Beijing does not simply owe money. It owes alignment. And when repayment pressures mount, Beijing gains leverage not just over financial policy, but over foreign policy itself. Debt becomes a silent lever, tilting nations toward China's sphere of influence without a single overt command being issued. Beijing's infrastructure of control is also reinforced by alliances. Organizations like BRICS, which now includes a growing number of influential nations, provide platforms to discuss alternatives to the dollar. These are not empty meetings, they are laboratories for cooperation, spaces where nations share strategies for breaking away from Washington's financial dominance. Each summit that ends with declarations about using local currencies or creating new financial tools is another brick in Beijing's silent fortress. What once seemed like fringe ideas are now becoming mainstream conversations among rising economies. And China is always at the center of the dialogue. The most remarkable part of this strategy is its patience. Unlike the US, which often seeks immediate results, China is willing to wait. It does not need the yuan to replace the dollar tomorrow or even in the next decade. All it needs is momentum, a gradual erosion of dependence, a slow shift in perception. By the time the cracks in the dollar's supremacy widen into visible fractures, Beijing's infrastructure will already be in place, ready to absorb the flow of trade and capital that slips from Washington's grasp. The genius of the plan is that it does not require confrontation. It only requires time. What emerges then is a portrait of power, built not through dramatic clashes, but through subtle construction. Ports, railways, payment systems, digital platforms, loans, contracts, all of these are pieces of a larger puzzle. Taken individually, they may seem like ordinary elements of global development and trade, but seen together, they form a vast, intricate network that gives Beijing control not just over its own destiny, but over the financial lifelines of countless other nations. It is not loud, it is not obvious, but it is there, growing stronger every year, a silent infrastructure designed to shift the balance of global power without ever announcing itself as a threat. Money has always been more than a medium of exchange. It is a language of trust, a mechanism of power, and often a battlefield where wars are fought without bloodshed. In the past, empires minted coins and stamped their rulers' faces on them to project authority. In the modern world, the United States projected its dominance through the dollar, woven into every trade agreement and financial network. But Beijing has been preparing a weapon that transcends paper, transcends even traditional banking, the digital yuan. This is not merely a technological experiment. It is a deliberate attempt to rewrite the rules of global finance, to create a system where money itself becomes a tool of surveillance, leverage, and quiet subversion. The story begins within China's own borders, where cash is already vanishing from daily life. In the cities, people rarely pull out paper bills. Instead, they scan QR codes with apps like Alipay and WeChat Pay. For hundreds of millions, digital transactions are so normal that physical money feels archaic. This cultural shift is not incidental. It is foundational. By normalizing digital money at home, Beijing laid the groundwork for something much bigger, a national digital currency controlled not by private companies, but by the state itself. The digital yuan, officially launched through pilot programs and now expanding across provinces, represents a fusion of money and governance in a way the world has never fully seen. What makes the digital yuan different from other currencies is not simply its form. It is the architecture behind it. Unlike Bitcoin or decentralized cryptocurrencies, which thrive on anonymity and independence, the digital yuan is centralized, programmable, and fully monitored by China's central bank. Every transaction can be tracked, every payment traced, every wallet identified. For Beijing, this creates unparalleled visibility into its economy. Taxes can be collected instantly, corruption harder to hide, and spending patterns mapped in real time. But beyond domestic efficiency lies something far more ambitious: the ability to export this model to the world. To understand why this matters, one must look at the vulnerabilities of the current global system. At its heart sits SWIFT, the messaging network that allows banks across borders to communicate and settle payments. SWIFT is tied to the dollar and, by extension, to Washington's authority. If a country angers the United States, it risks being cut off, effectively isolated from global trade. Russia experienced this firsthand after the invasion of Ukraine, when sanctions targeted its access to dollar systems. For nations watching from the sidelines, the lesson was clear. Dependence on the dollar means vulnerability to Washington's will. The digital yuan offers an escape. Imagine a transaction between two countries, say China and an oil producer in the Middle East. Traditionally, that deal would pass through dollar-based networks, routed through Western banks and systems that could be scrutinized or blocked. With the digital yuan, that transaction can occur instantly, directly, and outside Washington's gaze. No intermediary, no SWIFT, no vulnerability. For nations weary of America's financial dominance, this is not just attractive, it is revolutionary. It creates a parallel channel where money flows beyond the reach of the dollar's shadow. The power of the digital yuan, however, extends beyond bypassing sanctions. Because it is programmable, Beijing can attach conditions directly to the currency. Imagine money that can only be spent on certain goods within certain time frames or by certain users. Aid packages could be distributed as digital yuan wallets, but only usable to purchase Chinese goods, locking recipient nations deeper into Beijing's economic ecosystem. Loans could be issued in digital yuan with built-in repayment mechanisms, ensuring compliance without lengthy negotiations. This transforms money into a policy tool, a lever of control embedded into the very code of the currency. There is also a psychological dimension to this warfare. Nations that adopt the digital yuan, even in limited ways, are signaling a shift in allegiance. It is not just about convenience, it is about trust. By holding reserves in digital yuan, settling contracts in it, or integrating it into their payment systems, countries gradually detach from the dollar's orbit. The more they rely on Beijing's digital rails, the harder it becomes to return. Like a spider's web, every strand of adoption strengthens China's hold. And because the system is digital, adoption can spread far faster than traditional financial reforms ever could. A mobile app can cross borders more quickly than any bank branch or treaty. Critics in the West often dismiss the digital yuan as a domestic project, pointing out that its international use is still limited. But this perspective underestimates Beijing's strategy. China does not need the digital yuan to replace the dollar overnight. It only needs to establish beachheads, small but significant footholds in global trade. Pilot programs with neighboring countries, integration into Belt and Road projects, acceptance in key energy contracts, each of these is a test case, a signal to the world that alternatives are not only possible, but already operational. Over time, momentum builds, and what was once experimental becomes standard practice. Technology amplifies this momentum. In a world moving toward faster, cheaper, and borderless transactions, traditional banking feels outdated. Cross-border transfers through SWIFT can take days with layers of fees and intermediaries. The digital yuan, by contrast, can move instantly at minimal cost directly between parties. For businesses and governments alike, efficiency is not a luxury, it is a necessity. And when efficiency aligns with sovereignty, when nations can trade without fearing sanctions or oversight, the appeal becomes irresistible. Yet, the digital yuan is not just about convenience or sovereignty. It is also about data. In the digital age, data is power, and Beijing understands this better than most. Every transaction in digital yuan creates a data point. Multiply this across millions of users, billions of payments, and hundreds of nations, and the result is a treasure trove of financial intelligence. While Washington struggles to monitor flows through decentralized systems or cash transactions, Beijing's model ensures nothing escapes its notice. In the long run, this data advantage could prove as powerful as the currency itself, allowing China to predict economic trends, detect vulnerabilities, and apply pressure with surgical precision. This is why some analysts call it digital yuan warfare. It is not warfare in the traditional sense with armies and weapons, but warfare through control of money, data, and systems by building its own rails and inviting others to ride on them. Beijing is laying the foundation for a new kind of empire, one built not on territories but on transactions. And unlike physical conquest, which provokes immediate resistance, digital conquest often feels invisible until it is complete. By the time nations realize how dependent they have become, the web is already too tight to escape. The most striking aspect of this development is how quietly it is advancing. Western headlines focus on China's military maneuvers or its geopolitical disputes, but the digital yuan rarely takes center stage. Yet, in the long arc of history, it may prove more consequential than any aircraft carrier border clash. Because if money is the bloodstream of global power, then whoever controls its flow controls the future. The digital yuan is Beijing's attempt to seize that control, not with noise, but with code, not with threats, but with inevitability. And while the world debates, experiments, and doubts, the system is already live, expanding step by step, transaction by transaction, weaving a new financial reality that challenges the very foundations of the dollar's supremacy. There are moments when the world pays attention, not because of what is said, but because of who dares to say it. In China, few figures have carried the same weight of global recognition as Jack Ma. Known for founding Alibaba and symbolizing the rise of China's entrepreneurial spirit, he has often been portrayed as the face of Chinese innovation, a man who bridged East and West through commerce and technology. But when Jack Ma issued his warning about the dollar's future, it was not the words alone that shocked the audience. It was the fact that he of all people would voice them. His position, his history, and his credibility turned the statement into an earthquake that rippled through boardrooms, trading floors, and government chambers. For years, Jack Ma's represented the success story of China's integration into global capitalism. His company brought millions of Chinese merchants onto the global stage. His vision of e-commerce rivaled Western giants, and his charisma reassured skeptics that China's rise was not simply about state power, but about individual brilliance and private innovation. So when such a figure hinted that the world was entering a post-dollar era, observers could not dismiss it as propaganda or political maneuvering. It came across instead as a glimpse into insider thinking, a signal that the confidence in the dollar's supremacy was not only fading among China's policymakers, but also among its most celebrated business leaders. What made his words even more potent was the context in which they were delivered. At the time, the world was already uneasy. Trade wars had strained relations between Washington and Beijing. Sanctions had reminded nations of the risks of dollar dependency, and global debt was ballooning. Against this backdrop, Jack Ma's statement felt less like speculation and more like confirmation. He was not predicting in abstract terms. He was pointing to a reality that was already unfolding. And because he was known for spotting trends before others saw them, people listened carefully. Investors who had dismissed the idea of de-dollarization suddenly reran their models. Analysts who had scoffed at the yuan's rise began drafting scenarios where the dollar's dominance weakened faster than expected. What stunned observers most was not simply that he said the dollar's supremacy was in jeopardy, but the tone with which he said it. It was not laced with aggression or triumphalism. Instead, it carried a matter-of-fact quality, as if he were describing an inevitability that could no longer be ignored. This tone made his words more unsettling. A boast can be dismissed, but a calm prediction from someone with global credibility feels like a verdict. The fact that Jack Mallers framed it, not as a distant possibility, but as a development already in motion, struck a nerve. For decades, economists had debated when or if the dollar would face serious competition. Suddenly, here was one of China's most recognizable figures, saying the shift was closer than most believed. The shock was amplified by what happened afterward. Not long after making bold remarks about finance and regulation, Jack Ma disappeared from public view for months. His companies faced intense scrutiny from Chinese authorities, and speculation swirled about whether he had crossed invisible red lines. This disappearance turned his earlier warning into something even more dramatic. Observers began to ask whether his comments about the dollar had struck too close to a sensitive truth. Was his prediction aligned with Beijing's strategy, or had he revealed something prematurely? The mystery surrounding his silence only deepened the impact of his words. Investors and governments alike began treating his statement not just as an opinion, but as a clue to China's internal thinking about the future of global finance. The idea that Jack Ma's warning reflected more than personal opinion gained traction because of his connections and visibility. He had long been close to policymakers, had navigated international markets, and had dealt with the very mechanisms that underpin global finance. If he believed the dollar was at risk of being dethroned, then it was likely informed by conversations and insights not available to the average observer. His vantage point was unique, at once deeply tied to China's domestic system and intimately familiar with the world beyond it. This dual perspective made his prediction feel weightier than anything written in an academic paper or announced by a politician. Another reason his words carried shock was because they tapped into existing anxieties outside China. In Europe, many had grown weary of dollar dependency, especially after years of watching U.S. sanctions disrupt global trade. In the Middle East, oil producers were already experimenting with deals denominated in yuan. In Africa, Chinese loans and trade had become lifelines. In Latin America, leaders openly complained about the vulnerabilities tied to the dollar. Jack Ma's prediction seemed to connect all these dots. He gave voice to what many governments had been whispering privately: the world was ready for alternatives. Coming from him, the message had legitimacy and urgency. It was no longer just a theory, it was a trend already alive in multiple corners of the globe. The shock value also came from the implications his words carried for the global order. If the dollar's supremacy fades, it is not simply a matter of shifting currencies. It is a matter of shifting power. The United States has been able to project influence not only through its military, but through its control of global finance. If countries can trade, save, and settle debts outside the dollar, Washington loses its most effective non-military weapon. Jack Ma's warning implied that this weapon was dulling, that the cracks were widening, and that Beijing was prepared to step into the gap. For U.S. policymakers and allies, this was not just about economics. It was about geopolitics, about the very foundation of global influence. In the financial world, his statement triggered debates that still echo. Could central banks realistically diversify away from the dollar? How quickly could yuan-denominated trade grow? What role would digital currencies play in accelerating the shift? And most importantly, how would Washington respond? Traders who once assumed the dollar was untouchable began hedging differently. Analysts who had scoffed at de-dollarization scenarios began giving them more weight in their reports. Even the mere act of recalculating probabilities was significant. It meant the idea of a post-dollar world had entered mainstream discussion, and Jack May was the catalyst. The broader shock lay in the realization that the challenge to the dollar was not coming from fringe actors or hostile states alone, but from within the logic of global markets themselves. Jackman had built his empire on connecting buyers and sellers, on understanding how trade flows evolve and how technology reshapes habits. When someone with that background predicts the decline of the dollar's supremacy, it cannot be brushed aside as political rhetoric. It must be treated as a business calculation, a recognition that patterns are shifting beneath the surface. In this sense, his words were not simply a warning. They were a diagnosis. For many observers, the unsettling part was the possibility that he was right sooner than expected. History teaches that dominant currencies often last longer than critics predict, yet they rarely last forever. The British pound once held the same aura the dollar does today, but 2 world wars and economic strain eventually dethroned it. If Jack Ma's words were correct, the dollar might face a similar fate, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual erosion. And if the erosion was already underway, then the world had less time than it thought to prepare. The shock was not just in hearing the prediction, it was in realizing that the countdown might have already begun. Dependency has always been the quiet chain that determines the hierarchy of nations. For decades, the world's dependence on the dollar gave Washington unrivaled leverage. Every government, every corporation, every central bank had to factor the greenback into its decisions. It was the lubricant of trade, the ultimate store of value, the benchmark by which everything else was measured. But dependency is never static. It shifts with circumstance, with alliances, with the reconfiguration of global flows. What once bound the world to Washington is now slowly binding the world to Beijing, and this shift is not accidental. It is the result of a deliberate strategy, executed patiently, where China transforms others' needs into instruments of its own leverage. Consider energy, the lifeblood of every economy. For decades, oil was priced in dollars, a system reinforced by the so-called petrodollar arrangement that cemented America's grip over energy markets. To buy oil, nations first had to buy dollars, which kept global demand for the currency perpetually high. But China, as the world's largest energy importer, has flipped this dynamic. It has negotiated contracts where oil and gas are paid for in yuan, not dollars. With Russia, it has already moved billions in energy trade outside the dollar system. With Middle Eastern producers, discussions of yuan-based settlements are no longer whispers, but open possibilities. Each barrel traded in yuan weakens the old system and strengthens Beijing's leverage. Energy producers reliant on Chinese demand find themselves compelled to accommodate the yuan, not because of ideology, but because of necessity. Trade is another channel through which dependency becomes leverage. China is the largest trading partner for more than 20 countries, from electronics in Europe to textiles in Africa, from minerals in Latin America to machinery in Asia. Chinese goods dominate supply chains. This dominance is not merely about cheap prices. It is about scale, consistency, and integration into global production. A nation that relies on China for critical imports cannot easily disentangle itself. If Beijing decides that certain goods must be traded in yuan or that certain contracts must flow through its financial systems, those nations face a stark choice: comply or face disruption. Washington once held this kind of leverage through the dollar. Now Beijing wields it through the sheer weight of its trade. Debt is perhaps the most subtle but potent form of dependency. Chinese banks and institutions have lent hundreds of billions to developing nations, financing ports, roads, railways, and energy projects. These loans are not always transparent, and the terms often bind countries tightly to Beijing. When repayment becomes difficult, China does not simply demand its money back. It demands concessions, control over strategic infrastructure, favorable trade deals, or political alignment, often become the currency of repayment. This creates a form of leverage that extends far beyond economics. A country indebted to China is not just financially dependent, it becomes strategically pliable. And when those debts are denominated in yuan, the loop tightens further, pulling nations deeper into Beijing's orbit. Shipping routes add yet another layer to this web of leverage. China has invested heavily in port infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe, securing footholds along critical maritime corridors. These ports are not just commercial assets, they are choke points of global trade. When a Chinese-financed port in Pakistan or Greece becomes indispensable to international shipping, it places entire regions under Beijing's indirect influence. The ships may carry goods for many nations, but the infrastructure that facilitates the flow is tied to China. By linking logistics to its financial systems, Beijing ensures that physical dependency feeds into monetary dependency, reinforcing the yuan's role as the settlement tool of choice. Central banks themselves are beginning to reflect this shift. Countries frustrated by dollar volatility or wary of sanctions are quietly diversifying their reserves. Instead of holding only dollars, they are adding yuan, signing swap agreements with the People's Bank of China, and preparing mechanisms to settle trade directly in the Chinese currency. For smaller nations, this diversification is not about ideology. It is about survival. Holding yuan reserves ensures smoother trade with China, reduces transaction costs, and signals alignment with Beijing's growing financial sphere. The more central banks hold yuan, the more natural it becomes for others to follow, creating a self-reinforcing cycle where dependency on China begets even greater dependency. The Belt and Road Initiative serves as the overarching framework tying all these dependencies together. Ports, pipelines, railways, and highways stretch across continents, all financed by Chinese capital and built by Chinese firms. Each project locks participants into long-term relationships that extend beyond construction. Repayments, supply agreements, and maintenance contracts often require continued engagement with Chinese institutions. Over time, this creates a lattice of dependency where opting out becomes impossible without severe economic pain. For many countries, their infrastructure literally carries Beijing's imprint, making them more willing to accept yuan settlements and Chinese financial terms as the cost of continued growth. What makes this leverage particularly powerful is that it often appears voluntary. Nations choose to trade with China because it is their largest market. They accept loans because alternatives are scarce or come with stricter conditions. They buy Chinese goods because they are affordable and reliable. They agree to yuan settlements because it saves costs and pleases their largest partner. But the cumulative effect of these choices is a profound dependency. Once embedded, it gives Beijing quiet but immense power. Washington once forced nations into compliance by threatening exclusion from the dollar system. Beijing achieves compliance by making itself indispensable, offering opportunities that feel irresistible until the dependency becomes irreversible. This shift is not lost on those who study global finance. Economists note that the rise of a new reserve currency does not happen overnight. It requires infrastructure, trust, and widespread usage. China has been building all three. Its financial networks offer alternatives to SWIFT. Its digital yuan offers cutting-edge efficiency, and its global trade dominance provides the demand to sustain them. The leverage is not abstract, it is practical. A nation that owes China money buys Chinese goods and sells resources to Chinese buyers, is already halfway to de-dollarization without even announcing it. Dependency has become the path, and leverage the inevitable result. For the United States, this dynamic poses a new kind of threat. Sanctions, once a decisive tool, lose power when nations can bypass the dollar system entirely. Threats of exclusion mean little if trade and loans can be settled in yuan. Even allies begin to calculate differently, balancing their ties to Washington with their dependencies on Beijing. This is not about sudden abandonment of the dollar, but about gradual recalibration. And with each recalibration, the dollar's supremacy looks less like destiny and more like a fading privilege. In the past, America's dominance rested on the fact that the world could not function without it. Now, China is making the world function in ways that require it more than Washington. The transformation is already visible in the behavior of nations caught between these two poles. They hedge their bets, diversify their reserves, and test yuan settlements. They speak of multipolar finance, but in practice, it means preparing for a world where China's leverage matters as much, if not more, than America's. This is the essence of Beijing's strategy, not confrontation, but entanglement. By making itself indispensable to global trade, energy, and finance, it ensures that others' dependence becomes its leverage, and that leverage becomes the quiet force that redraws the map of power. Every era in history has been defined by the struggle for supremacy between dominant powers. Sometimes those struggles erupted on battlefields, with armies clashing and borders redrawn. Other times, they played out in boardrooms, at negotiating tables, or through technologies that shifted the balance of advantage. Today, the looming struggle is financial, a clash between two titans whose currencies represent not just money, but entire systems of power, values, and influence. On one side stands the US dollar, the long-reigning monarch of global finance, underpinned by decades of trust, liquidity, and the shadow of American military might. On the other side emerges the yuan, increasingly supported by a rising economic empire, digital innovation, and a vision of a multipolar world where Washington no longer dictates the rules. The dollar's supremacy has always been about more than economics. Its role as the world's reserve currency gave Washington a kind of invisible empire. Through the dollar, America could fund its deficits cheaply, project sanctions globally, and ensure that every major trade passed through its orbit. This was not merely a financial advantage, it was the backbone of American hegemony. When crises struck, investors fled to the dollar as a safe haven. When wars erupted, commodities priced in dollars ensured Washington maintained leverage. The Federal Reserve became, by extension, the central bank of the world, and Wall Street the ultimate arbiter of value. For decades, there was no serious challenger. The dollar was not just dominant, it was unrivaled. But in the shadows of this dominance, China has been methodically building the foundations of an alternative. Unlike past rivals, which often challenged US power militarily, Beijing has chosen the financial battlefield. It understands that to dethrone the dollar, it must not only strengthen the yuan, but also weaken the world's faith in the dollar's inevitability. Every trade deal signed in yuan, every loan denominated outside the dollar, every partnership that integrates China's payment systems chips away at that faith. It is a strategy of attrition, not shock, and it is working, because the dollar's dominance is already showing cracks. from inflationary waves exported worldwide to the increasing use of sanctions that expose its politicized nature. The coming clash will not be decided by speeches or treaties, but by choices made in capitals and corporations around the globe. For oil producers, the question will be whether to continue pricing contracts exclusively in dollars or to diversify into yuan settlements. For central banks, the choice will be whether to hold reserves overwhelmingly in US treasuries or to hedge with Chinese bonds and yuan assets. For developing nations, the dilemma will be whether to seek loans from Western institutions with strings attached or from Chinese lenders who demand compliance through other means. Each decision may appear incremental, but together they form the tide that could tilt the balance. The clash is not a single event. It is 1,000 decisions converging into a transformation. What makes this clash unprecedented is the role of technology. The digitalization of money is accelerating. And here Beijing holds an edge. The digital yuan is not only a domestic experiment, but a prototype for a global system where financial transactions are faster, cheaper, and most importantly, outside Washington's control. In a future where instant digital payments are the norm, nations will ask themselves whether they want to rely on systems linked to the Federal Reserve or those tied to China's central bank. The answer will not always be ideological. It will be practical. If the digital yuan offers efficiency, sovereignty, and integration with China's massive trade networks, the incentives to adopt it will outweigh the risks. Technology, therefore, is not a side note. It is the accelerant that could push the yuan into direct confrontation with the dollar. The clash will also have a cultural and psychological dimension. For decades, the dollar has been a symbol of stability, something people trusted even in the darkest times. The yuan, by contrast, has been perceived as the tool of a tightly controlled system, opaque and politically managed. Beijing's challenge is to shift that perception, to project the yuan not as a restriction, but as liberation from US dominance. Its narrative is already taking shape, that the dollar is a weapon, while the yuan is a neutral alternative, that America uses the dollar to punish, while China uses the yuan to build. Whether or not this narrative reflects reality, it resonates with nations tired of dependence and eager for autonomy. The psychological battlefield may prove as decisive as the economic one. For the United States, the coming clash is not something it can easily prevent. The dollar's strength rests on the size of the US economy, the openness of its markets, and the trust in its institutions. Yet each of these pillars faces strain. Political dysfunction, ballooning debt, and increasing use of the dollar as a weapon erode the very trust that sustains it. If Washington continues to treat the dollar as a lever of foreign policy rather than a neutral instrument of global exchange, it risks accelerating the very outcome it fears. Nations will not abandon the dollar out of hostility alone. They will do so out of self-preservation, seeking insulation from the vulnerabilities that dollar dependence creates. The clash, however, is not guaranteed to produce clean victory for either side. It may not end with the yuan simply replacing the dollar, as the dollar once replaced the pound. Instead, it could produce a fragmented landscape, a multipolar financial system where no single currency dominates. In such a world, the dollar remains powerful but diminished, the yuan influential but not absolute, and regional blocs rely increasingly on their own currencies for trade. This outcome would still represent a profound shift, stripping Washington of its unique privilege and forcing it to compete on more equal terms. For Beijing, even parity would be a triumph, proving that the era of unipolar finance is over. What adds urgency to this looming clash is the fact that the stakes extend far beyond economics. Currency dominance underpins strategic power. If the dollar weakens, America's ability to sanction adversaries, to fund its military machine cheaply, and to shape global institutions diminishes. If the yuan strengthens, China gains not only economic clout, but also geopolitical leverage, able to dictate terms to partners and rivals alike. Nations caught in between will face hard choices. Align with Washington and remain tethered to a system that may punish unpredictably, or align with Beijing and enter a system that promises stability but comes with its own strings. Many will attempt to straddle both, but the clash will make neutrality increasingly untenable. Already, signs of alignment are emerging. Russia has shifted much of its trade to yuan. Middle Eastern states openly discuss yuan settlements for oil. African nations indebted to China find themselves integrating yuan into their financial systems. Even in Europe, where loyalty to Washington runs deep, whispers of diversification grow louder, each time sanctions remind them of their vulnerability. These shifts may seem small in isolation, but together they signal that the tectonic plates of global finance are moving. And once such movements gain momentum, they are nearly impossible to reverse. The coming clash of financial titans will unfold quietly, without the spectacle of armies or the drama of revolutions. It will unfold in contracts, in reserves, in the hidden architecture of trade flows and digital systems. Yet its consequences will be no less dramatic. For centuries, money has determined empires as much as armies have. The pound once ruled until the dollar replaced it. Now the yuan stands ready, not as a distant possibility, but as an emerging rival. The clash is not about numbers on screens alone. It is about who writes the rules of the future, who decides the costs of defiance, and who reaps the privileges of global leadership.